Hello everyone, welcome to Internally Screening. Today we're going to be doing a rundown on our take on the Lord of the Rings, the Rings of Power show, which has been out on Amazon Prime for a while. We're a little bit late to the party, but we just sort of wanted to sit on it, digest it, and watch some of the sort of surrounding media that's similar to it, so we could compare it in context to other things, similar franchise products, and just kind of sit on it, because we're both massive Lord of the Rings fans, especially of the Peter Jackson films, which we have probably watched more than any other films at this point.
We grew up at the exact right time for them to come out when we were young, and just like yearly they've been on. Like a marathon will occur
almost constantly,
biannually.
Yeah, pretty much.
So,
I remember the films coming out; they were pretty much instantly the biggest fantasy thing ever, and they still, I think, just the shorthand of the visuals of those films is so influential in everything fantasy, including like even sort of sci-fi fantasy stuff. You can see Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings stuff in there just constantly, like all of the imagery, a lot of the storytelling tropes it employed as well, and obviously the books are massively influential as well. I've only read the first one ages ago when I was a kid, so we're going to steer away from comparing to the literary side of Lord of the Rings for the most part. But anyways, this is pretty much the first big Lord of the Rings product that has been put out for the public since the Hobbit films, which if you remember the Hobbit films, which I sometimes struggle to, they weren't as warmly received as Lord of the Rings were, mostly because they weren't very good. I'm being a little bit dismissive here, but
they certainly didn't hold a candle to the expectations laid upon them. And I think, having Peter Jackson come back somewhat begrudgingly to do them kind of left a sour taste in the mouth of what to come. The first two films were fine, but I think it really fumbled the bag on its final entry. And I think because it was the last one in the series, kind of soured the whole experience. Yeah,
I mean, there were very much examples of films that were living in the shadow of Lord of the Rings, trying to recreate that magic and not quite getting there. And that was kind of, when I heard that Amazon was making this series, I was really excited, because one of the big things that was being talked about was how much it cost. I remember this was sort of announced in pretty much peak Game of Thrones hype. Around sort of season 6-7 time, where people hadn't completely fallen out of love with Game of Thrones, which was sort of the only other fantasy thing that I've ever seen capture people's imaginations since the original Lord of the Rings trilogy. And it came out, it was going to be mega expensive. I was really impressed with the fact that they really weren't going with any classic known actors. They were going with a bunch of newbies, which I thought was kind of interesting. It was something that the Star Wars sequels had gone for, and at the time I was a big fan of, and I still actually kind of like that element.
For sure. 100%.
And I was kind of happy to see that, and it was just kind of exciting. Now it is based on the Silmarillion, so neither of us have any knowledge of the Silmarillion.
No.
As far as I'm aware, it's sort of a bunch of short stories and sort of bits and pieces that isn't even entirely written by J.R.R. Tolkien, so I don't really know.
It's my understanding it is all written by him, but a lot of it is edited by his son and another writer who came in posthumously and sort of assembled it for sort of a general audience. So I don't know exactly how much input they had onto the specific written text.
But I mean, what I generally understood from it was the Silmarillion was a bit of a blank slate that you could do a lot with.
It's kind of a list of lore, like of untold stories done in a sort of short form format.
So in principle it's kind of a blank slate with like the perfect amount of direction to get you going. And since it cost 57 million per episode, which I'm pretty sure is still a record of some kind, straight Bezos bucks out of the bank, straight into some Lord of the Rings stuff, I was super hyped. And this was, I guess, when this came out, this was before a time where my mind had been soured by the sort of Amazon original logo coming up. Should come up with a horror sting at this point, because it is so terrifying. I was just excited, and it's finally here, and I think it's safe to say reactions have been mixed.
Yeah, you could say that. I think, broadly speaking, before we get too far into it, my feelings are not as like sort of swaying to either end of the scale. They're not so binary. Is it terrible? Is it brilliant? I've got kind of a more measured feeling of its good qualities and its bad qualities.
You sound like you're on the Elven Council, mate. Trying to take the middle ground.
No, but I think a lot of the reaction that came out to it when it initially dropped was, oh my god, this is terrible, this is the most boring show I've ever seen, and things like that. And while there's certainly things within those criticisms I can agree with, I don't think it's quite as terrible as a lot of people make it out to be.
I mean, so before we jump into the reaction and all the fallout, we're going to just quickly, well, not quickly, we're going to go into our detail on the show extensively and just talk about whether it's good or not. So this is going to basically be piece made for, if you're watching this and you haven't seen it, we are kind of just going to talk about everything. So if you want to watch it without getting spoiled and you haven't yet, click away from the video, go and watch it, and come back to the video afterwards, crucially, because this is good quality.
This is content. The best part of all of it.
Oh yeah. For those of you unfamiliar, I don't know why you would be if you're watching the show, but this basically follows what it's made in the way I expected it to be made. It's a TV series based on sort of 3 or 4 main storylines that all branch out, converge, and you follow several different characters doing different things, much like Lord of the Rings, right? The main ones being a young Elrond and his dwarven friend. You have Galadriel sort of out on her own quest that kind of crosses a lot of different paths. You have a new elf archer character and his healer romance interest type person, and you also have a storyline around the Harfoots, or this sort of nomadic pre-Hobbit peoples as they encounter a mysterious stranger. And these storylines kind of progress and go on. What did you think about Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, in terms of how good it was?
Okay, when I mentioned that it was boring, that was a criticism levied at it quite often. I would agree with that.
Yes, I do agree.
I think the pace is glacial to extremes. And you kind of wait the whole series for it to be building to something like huge and satisfying to kind of justify your wait. And it never really quite hits those heights. It does have its dramatic climaxes, but they're never quite as gratifying as the amount of time you've invested in it. You feel like you're owed.
It feels so slow as well, because I've actually heard this criticism of people who maybe aren't that into fantasy when they watch Lord of the Rings and say like, oh, it's really boring, it's really long. And like, I just don't really understand it, because while there are long periods of the film without like huge action or spectacle, there's always like drama. There's always like intrigue. There's like atmosphere. And then I guess what this show didn't really feel like it had to me was that pressing sense of tension that Lord of the Rings has, like a real motivation.
Like a ticking clock kind of aspect to it.
Because the Ring is the ultimate ticking clock, right?
100%. I think we kind of introduced through the veil of Galadriel, through her perception of the world, like she's hunting down Sauron. She's sort of told to end her quest. Is traveling back to Valinor and then decides, nah, fuck this. I've still got unfinished business.
Because her brother is killed in the prologue, right?
In
a battle.
Morgoth. And I think a crucial problem with framing the story in that way is that I don't think they particularly get the characterization of Galadriel right. In so much as I understand that she's not the same Galadriel we know from 1,000 years later in Lord
She's
of the
almost
Rings.
like the opposite kind of character at this stage, right?
But I think regardless of what they chose to do with her character, one key decision they made was to make her very obnoxious. She's very argumentative, very kind of dismissive and arrogant and all these things, which can be gripping elements within a character that is a protagonist in spite of those flaws. But they're married together in like a really unwelcoming kind of snide package.
I just never really felt like, because the core concept of the character is that she is traumatized by the death of her brother. And she is too obsessed with trying to avenge him without maybe fully understanding her own motivations and maybe disguising her own motivations in something more honourable than it actually is, or more meaningful than it actually is. So that, like, you can do a lot with that. That's like a great character concept. It's very simple. It's not like, if you just state it like that, there's not tons to it, but you can build on that. But I agree with you. It's like, and Morphith Clark, who plays her, I've seen her be an excellent actress in Saint Maud, where she gives a really layered, traumatized character portrayal. It's almost a character portrait, that film. And so I know she has that depth, and I think the problem kind of has to come from the writing. Because you're right, she just kind of seems annoying.
And it's not just, it doesn't just lay at her feet. I think it's an issue from the get-go, in that because we begin with her character in the same way that we kind of begin Lord of the Rings with Frodo. If Frodo had been an annoying little shitbag from the get-go, and then you have to sit through an hour and a half of him walking around with his friends until he gets to Rivendell, that would be miserable. But the fact that there's so much more warmth to his character and the people around him, that build is still, in spite of it being perhaps a little glacial to some, it's a far more satisfying experience because you're building his character through that journey.
I think the bigger problem for me, in my take on Galadriel and why she's not very good in this show, is mostly that the situation she's put in never really seemed to get the most out of her character.
Okay.
She's kind of interesting, you know, on the raft and then trying to survive on the raft.
Yeah.
That's kind of interesting. But the moment she gets to Numenor and you have all this political intrigue, there's only little moments where I actually kind of like her character.
Yeah, it's a good point. She doesn't really have a huge amount to do.
No, exactly. And I think, so like, for example, the reason Frodo is a boring character in concept from the get-go. What's interesting about Frodo is the fact that he's put in such a like intense situation.
Okay, yeah.
And then slowly through that situation, you kind of learn more about his character and
Yeah.
he becomes interesting. Whereas like the only moment I sort of found interesting about Galadriel was her being obnoxious in like the king's court or whatever.
Oh, yeah.
And then when she was kind of like locked up, Halbrand kind of being like, oh, you really, you know, played your cards wrong there. Like you were too obnoxious. And, you know, she sort of like takes the L.
Yeah.
I thought that was like kind of an interesting moment, but that's like pretty much the only interesting character moment that I really remember from her.
In terms of the Numenor storyline, her presence pretty much solely seems to function as a means of displaying the distaste for elves among human communities, particularly Numenor, because it had such a historical blend of those two influences. So yeah, she's almost like a placeholder for any elf. Yeah, she like anyone could have been there, and she's like pressing for them to go to the Southlands later on. But it's the same sort of thing. It feels like any old dude could have done that. Like you could have switched to Elrond and Galadriel in those instances and potentially had the same outcome.
Like the arrogant elf in a human land could have been really interesting or fun as a story, right? It's sort of like a fish out of water, but I just don't really feel like they got any of that.
No.
And yeah, you're right, because the series never, if she'd have spent like a bit of time in Numenor and you had that for a bit, that would have been fine, right? But maybe she has to do something where, you know, her biases or her trauma are somehow brought up or challenged or whatever. And I just think the show just doesn't really do anything.
There's only one moment I can think of where she finds the sigil of Sauron and is like, oh my god, it's a map. And it does kind of provide what you're talking about, but it's such a seemingly small moment, or not a small moment, but it's such a sort of isolated moment in a sort of sea of kind of a lot of dilly-dallying, a lot of time wasting.
Yeah.
I think that's something that the show is generally guilty of throughout much of its runtime.
Padding.
Yeah. Speaking of wasting our time, would you like to talk about the Harfoots?
Well, the Harfoots, as you know, having watched it with me, were my least favourite element of the show, and I'll just quickly explain why. I fucking hate them. They're so annoying. Harfoots, when people who don't like Lord of the Rings say, oh, I don't like Lord of the Rings, it's got too many hobbits on it. I don't really get it, because the hobbits in Lord of the Rings are kind of just like there in the beginning, and then, you know, as a bit of fun setup. Yeah, they're kind of like, and it's like a fun little prologue, and then literally they're gone.
Yeah.
And you literally just have like 4 hobbits for the rest of the fucking 12 hours of the film, right?
Yeah.
So, like, it's really, I don't really understand that as a criticism. The Harfoots in this show are exactly what people think the hobbits in Lord of the Rings are.
Right.
They're annoying. They're not very interesting. They're just kind of like, oh, we're hobbits but nomadic.
Yeah.
And the show is kind of obsessed with trying to get this sickeningly sugary, wholesome, magical vibe out of like, oh, they're so wonderful. And there are just like so many scenes where they're in any kind of peril where the show is just begging to try and make you cry, or try and make you emotional, and it so doesn't work. All the characters are just so like horribly placid and annoying and like sweet and boring. And the introduction of the stranger, which should be a kind of fun, interesting mystery, really does very little. There's not really any fun chemistry between them, even though they're kind of trying to make that with the character dynamic of him being sort of sinister and weird.
Yes.
I completely got nothing out of that storyline.
Yeah. I think from what you're saying, there's such a transparency in the way they're trying to manipulate the audience into being like, oh, aren't these characters super cute, that they actually forget to do anything particularly interesting or characterize them in any meaningful depth other than cute little tiny people, and they just sort of wander around. They get spooked by a big scary wizard. And a wolf, and then they have some arguments. Lenny Henry's there, the only name in the cast list that I recognised before this. And that's kind of that. There's, you know, it kind of builds to its climax towards the end, but I had to sort of remind myself of a lot of what happened in this series because so little of it left an impression.
Every time that storyline came up, my sort of physical reaction was,
Yeah, oh god, we've got another 10 minutes with these fuckers.
And what I hate as well is like the hobbits aren't that boring. It's such a like horrible caricature of what hobbits are. The hobbits like smoke weed. They're obsessed with drinking, just getting smashed every night in the pub, and then they just sit around doing fuck all, and they maybe do some like gardening, right?
Yeah.
So they've taken there is a little bit of edge to the hobbits, and they've just sort of taken it away.
The hobbits are just like a sort of circus mirror of English villages and stuff. Yeah, like just sort of like quaint.
This is what it's like in Cornwall.
Yeah, like the pastoral view of what England is like to either Americans or people with rose-tinted spectacles going, I like the good old days.
Oh, no, they're definitely from Yorkshire, aren't they?
It could be from anywhere. You could be from any isolated little village where there's just like a pub and a field with some sheep. That's the Shire. That's hobbits. That's what Harfoot should be. And Harfoot's kind of. I respect having them kind of be. I like the choice of them being nomadic because it's a kind of interesting lead into like, oh well, maybe they settle down in this place. They find somewhere safe for them.
Seems to be
like
what
a
they
haven.
do, right? At the end of the series.
There's an implication of that. But yeah, there's just so little meat on the bone when it comes to it. It feels like, even though from what I'm saying about the hobbits being kind of based off of this kind of tropey idea of the pastoral England, there's a lot more to it that they bring out, and there's a warmth to all of it that feels natural. It feels like imbued in the characters.
But the film also doesn't just like press on it immediately.
No, and I think the key distinction in my mind is one achieves it naturally and one is trying to emulate it. And doesn't have a full understanding of like the intricacies of, right, here's your template, then you build upon it. It feels like we've just been given this blank kind of skeletal structure of what these people are supposed to be like. And then it's like, oh yeah, well, now you should like them because they're fucking. That one has rosy cheeks. Don't you want to squeeze the cheeks?
Yeah, I know. It really, like, I can't understate how sickening I find it in its syrupy, trying to make you cry. It's like one of my least favourite things that films do ever, really. And I honestly hated it. And what I find frustrating, I guess it's worth mentioning, this is a big spoiler. The stranger does, after much speculation, in the final episode turn out to be Gandalf. Which sort of makes sense from a narrative standpoint, given that Gandalf in Lord of the Rings has sort of an affinity for the hobbits. And he's sort of being hunted by this Sauron-ish demonic peoples.
These like trio.
And I think another big problem with this storyline, similar to Galadriel, is that they're just kind of doing nothing. They have to sort of vaguely move from one place to another. And then it's only in the last episode, or maybe the last 2 episodes, I think the very last one though, where the stranger is being hunted by these like mysterious forces. That should have been in the first episode, and it should have been like, oh, they have to like fucking get away. There's an immediate threat, right? Because I think a big problem this show has is, even in a lot of its good elements, it refuses to pose proper threat. And like create a pushing forward tension.
I agree. I think not so much in terms of threat, but in terms of forward momentum, I find it hilarious that in a show called...
momentum is a good way of putting it,
I find it hilarious in a show called The Rings of Power that we basically forget Celebrimbor exists for like the majority of the episodes. It's like, at the beginning, it's like, I think we should try and save the elves somehow, maybe with some kind of magical item or I don't know. And then at the end, they're like, a ring. That'll do it. And
cool idea.
Yeah, great idea. I'll make rings. And then he makes some rings. And it's like, well, hang on. This is the key concept of your show. And he's just like fucking barely there.
Well, speaking of Celebrimbor, I guess this is probably where we're going to have the most sort of positive appraisal of the show. There's the storyline with a younger Elrond and is it
Durin,
who is his dwarven friend, and Elrond is sent to Durin's sort of mine city thing. Partially as a sort of diplomatic thing between the elves, but he's also trying to find out if there's a way that the dwarves have to help them save this elvish tree that's dying and supplants them with infinite life. I think the reason that this is the best storyline of the sort of 3 or 4 that we get is that it kind of has really immediate tension. And I think just on a base level, it's just the best acted and written section of the show. Which is funny because we criticise the show for being quite boring. Arguably, this has the least amount of things that actually happen in the show. But because it's well enough written, the characters have really good chemistry. And the tension is subtle but like there from the start,
100%.
and continues throughout. Because of all of that, it just ends up being the most effective. But it is sort of contrary to some of the criticisms of the show that even we agree with, right?
Yeah, well, okay. Well, say, all right, just briefly returning back to the Harfords, there is tension in some of the middle episodes of them trying to hide the stranger. And so you could argue, well, okay, you know, it's a subtle tension, but that's present, so why are you saying that that doesn't really count for anything? The stakes feel so low.
Yeah, it feels sort of coincidental. Almost.
Yes, and because we have no understanding of who the stranger is, we also don't know if we need to back him or not, because one of the key things throughout the show, and I think something that the creators and writers were really pinning a lot of bets on in terms of keeping people hooked is who is Sauron.
Right, yeah.
So with the stranger potentially being a villain, we don't really care if he's being hidden away. We have no investment in that character. And also we have so little investment in characters around them, and they're all such pleasant people.
Well, and he also doesn't talk, like, so like, why would we care about
and then there's the fact that once it is revealed, it's kind of oh, never mind, we carry on. There's a little bit of tension, but then it kind of evaporates. And with the dwarves versus the elves, we have a kind of understanding of the historical relations between those people being strained, and like this being like a kind of tipping point potentially between those two races. So a lot more is riding on it from the get-go. But then there's like the immediate interaction between Elrond and Durin is like, Durin's like, what the fuck are you doing here? You haven't seen me in 20 years. And he's like, oh, I'm sorry, I'm just an elf. I have no idea what I'm doing.
Been out doing elfish things.
Yeah, because 20 years is a blink in the eye for an elf. And yeah, just the kind of minor but important political implications in every interaction they have, because there's the possibility of something going horribly wrong even in the most minor of sentences, minor of sort of offhand lines, you know. So a lot is riding on it.
Yeah, I just think it feels like genuinely kind of, it's the only bit of the show that feels kind of organic. We're talking about how the Harfoot stuff feels really forced, and the Galadriel stuff feels really aimless. Whereas here, there's, I don't know, it feels like the writers were actually kind of inspired by the relationship between these two characters, because it kind of rubs off on a lot of the other characters around them, because Durin's wife is also really likable, and Durin's relationship with his father is really interesting, and like has probably one of the best scenes in the whole show based around it. Despite the fact I kind of warmed into it just because I was so put off by the rest of the show. Looking back on it, it's kind of funny how engaging this stuff is. I'm sort of trying to figure out as I'm describing it whether it's just really good or if it's just really good compared to the rest of the show. Because crucially, I do think even though it's good, it does have a lot of missed opportunity in it. Yeah. In terms of, I do think even despite the fact that it is good, it could maybe have been moved along at a more interesting pace. And maybe the intrigue to it could have been increased. But it is crucially just quite good. I guess the biggest problem is it kind of ends with what you were talking about with Celebrimbor.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, you know, they deliver some interesting stuff with like the mithril mines and things, because that's the kind of...
Again, that ends with the reveal, there's a Balrog.
Yes.
Which is like basically the whole storyline culminates to an Easter egg.
Yeah, which could end up being in season 2. I would be surprised if it doesn't end up in season 2. It has to be in season 2.
But like my reaction to it was just,
again, if that had happened mid-season.
Yes, yeah.
Because you could have accelerated all of the kind of political machinations going on and then had the Balrog. And then it likely will be, but could have been a more kind of pressing point of political tension between these two people, because it's suddenly like, you know, in you trying to get what you want from us, we have unleashed solely onto us something that's going to fucking kill everyone. You don't have to worry about a Balrog. He's just going to stay in the mountains, but we're all going to die. But I think for me, it is as simple as it coming down to just two actors who have brilliant chemistry with one another, like, and
an interesting conflict. Writing.
I think if they'd have perhaps, because you know there are other kind of duos throughout the series, like Galadriel and Halbrand. I forget the elven guy's name and his love interest.
I forget the name.
There's just this kind of something just doesn't mesh.
They feel familiar, so you really actually. I think the crucial thing is they really managed to sell the idea that they're old friends.
Yes.
And the tension is believable, and there's some actually like really funny, good humour as well, which is something that people sort of forget about Lord of the Rings, like the original trilogies. Like it's very funny a lot of the time. A lot of the characters have great banter, and this is probably the only time you ever really get that.
Yeah, you're right. It is a very self-serious show.
Really?
There's no levity.
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of the levity is supposed to come from the Harfers.
Which is probably why they're so obnoxious, because it's like, oh, we've waited until this episode. We're just going to dump on you 10 minutes of like gooey, mushy, funny shit, and it's just none of it lands because. Yeah.
And then I guess the sort of final portion of the show to talk about is the elven archer and his human love interest, which I have sort of mixed feelings on. I didn't hate it, but I didn't love it either.
I think this is probably one of the most gripping in terms of the mystery element, because he's right in the heart of, spoiler alert,
Mordor.
A brief tangent. We have to address the Southlands.
Oh right, yeah. I mean, this show does have some embarrassing moments, but I think the most embarrassing has to be the Mordor title screen.
Basically someone scribbling out Southland and writing Mordor in spooky black text.
Like, really, really embarrassing. Yeah. I don't know how that made it past the editing table, to be completely honest, as if like it wasn't obvious. Because I guess the problem with that as well is this show, we'll come into this in more detail, but the show is very reliant at times on your pre-existing love of things from the films.
For sure.
So to then be like, oh, by the way, this is Mordor.
Yeah.
It's like, we all fucking
smacking you around.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah, a fucking volcano just went off. Where do we think this is supposed to be?
Yeah, it's like so obvious, and they still like spell it out for you. So I guess that's kind of a show of the level of respect this show has for its audience.
Yes.
But this storyline, I guess you're right, it's more interesting in that it has the most amount of action related to it. Something that I personally found really disappointing about the show is the general lack of spectacle. And one of the big spectacles in Lord of the Rings is they are 3 excellent action films.
Oh, for sure.
And you can sort of talk about, well, the books aren't, blah, blah, blah. Tolkien's all about, like, loving forests and stuff. But crucially, the reason this stuff is so popular is because the fucking battle scenes in Lord of the Rings are amazing.
Yeah.
And the action scenes are amazing. And this show has maybe 4 or 5 throughout 8 episodes.
Yeah, for the amount of time you have to invest, you get really little in terms of like the bang for your buck.
Yeah.
I think something we started watching, which we haven't finished yet, is House of the Dragon.
Yeah.
And similarly paced episode to episode in terms of, much like Game of Thrones, there is a lot of sort of political machinations and people kind of scheming and doing the little bits here and there. Yeah. But in every episode, there is some kind of gripping highlight. It doesn't have to be action, but it just some kind of like
there's at least a character
moment of drama where you're like, oh my God, this is what this episode is for. Similarly, we've been watching Andor recently, and that's paced in a similar way, where you get some level of like sort of reward within each episode that kind of makes an episode feel like holistic as well as being part of a wider whole. Do you know what I mean?
With the Rings of Power, I sort of feel like one of those like monkeys in a psychology experiment. Where they're like, oh, if he presses the button, it will drop a sugar cube down.
Okay.
And I feel like I'm the monkey, like spamming the button, like give me the fucking morphine or whatever. But I'm just like not getting it, and I get that sounds sort of bad, like, oh, it's like real consumer attitude. But all I really want is for the show to be interesting, and it just doesn't offer the drama. So I think the show would have been a lot more enjoyable if it's like, well, the drama's not that great, but like it gives you something really spectacular every episode. I could have actually, from just a pure enjoyment perspective, written off a lot of negative feelings about some of the elements of the show. It's like, well, it does have this one thing that it does really well, and really what you get, especially when you've got like, you're always thinking back to the Lord of the Rings films, what you get in comparison are some small scale conflicts. Some of them are pretty good, some of them are okay, and some of them feel chucked in there for no reason. Like I think about the random street fight that sort of goes like a John Wick hand-to-hand combat scene for no reason. Do you remember that? It's in Numenor, I think.
Oh, right.
Just the guy just fights, and it's like suddenly becomes the raid, and it's like, okay.
Yeah. That was I remember that was actually very jarring because the camera work suddenly shifts. It's like they've
the second unit arrives and shoots it for them.
Yeah, it's like you say. Yeah, it's like they transplanted it from the raid or John Wick, and that kind of camera work is just not really appropriate within. It's not that it's not appropriate. It's just that it doesn't feature.
Nowhere,
it doesn't feature before or since, and it's like, how are you just going to change the way you're making the film? It'd be like it turned into a fucking cartoon halfway through without any explanation. It's that kind of jarring creative decision.
I also just don't. While I sort of found his storyline a little sort of interesting at points in terms of him being, enslaved at one point by these orcs and all of this, the elf character I didn't find particularly interesting.
He's not really got anything to him.
He's very sort of blandly heroic and tortured, and you sort of brought up Andor. It shows a real missed opportunity for what you can do with a storyline like that. So like in Andor, there's this long series of episodes where Andor is in prison.
Yeah.
And thinking back on it, imagine if you had a similar series about him being enslaved by the orcs. Him being enslaved by the orcs is literally one episode.
Yeah.
And he escapes at the end.
Yeah.
And looking back on it, that could have been really interesting because this story is all about establishing, this storyline in particular is about establishing Mordor and how the orcs behaved and how they progressed, and that would have been really interesting to sort of see him and a bunch of humans maybe like trying to escape from some orcs or and getting more of that orc interaction in.
Yeah, the irony being that for as glacial as this show is, the one time you wanted to actually sit down and explore something in depth, it chooses to blast through it within an episode because people will get bored of him just being stuck in a hole for the thing. And another issue being that the set for him in prison is just like some muddy roots. He's barely like head level in the ground sort of thing. Given what we see later and the expansive nature of the orcs' plans in Mordor, the fact that we are given such a tiny little slice of it and it's made to feel kind of weirdly cheap by the standards of the show, that's another huge missed opportunity for sure. Agree, But at least his plot advances us through the whole story.
It does move a lot quicker.
It's kind of basically, in spite of him not being the main character, he is the guy experiencing all of the shit that the main character should really be experiencing in terms of like all the important knowledge that progresses and propels.
He feels like more
forward.
of a main character than Galadriel.
Yeah. In spite of him being given absolutely fuck all character.
He's not characterised really, is he?
Which I can understand in so much as, in The Lord of the Rings, the least characterised character is probably Legolas. But that in some ways is attributed to like the kind of he is just supposed to be an aloof elf, and that is just what the elves are like, and he's a tertiary character really to everyone else, so you don't have to spend much time with him and go, oh god, now we've just got a scene with Legolas on his own, this is going to be boring as shit. We never have that, we never have to deal with that. So if you're going to have the focus on a singular elf, you have to give him more than just, oh, he's Legolas, but from 1,000 years in the past. He has to be more well-rounded like Elrond is. Yeah,
no, I completely agree. I guess something interesting you touched on there was the visuals, which, given the expense of the show, has been a pretty big talking point. Something I noticed is it's also produced by J.A. Bayona, who's directed a bunch of films like A Monster Calls and Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom, and he's sort of very known for being a very visual, sort of luscious and expansive visual director. And you can kind of see touches here and there where that is the case. I generally have a bit of a mixed opinion on the visuals of the show. I do think, disappointingly for the budget, it does sometimes look a little bit like an Amazon original show. I don't know if you've got that at points. Certainly more expensive, but
I don't know if I would go that far. It's one of those things where sometimes I think that the digital elements of the editing process can kind of muddy the hard work that people go into when it comes to set design, capturing beautiful vista shots, which of course Peter Jackson made synonymous with Lord of the Rings, and you have to have that sort of stuff in there. And I think when it does go for these sort of sweeping shots and sort of wide vistas, it is a beautiful show. I think it's one of the things it does most consistently in my mind, that it does feel like a rich, lived-in universe, and for many of its other flaws, like sometimes the world doesn't feel as sort of
very
like
clean to me.
It does. Yeah, it does. But I kind of like it to be a bit more drawn in some ways. Like you kind of get pockets of a lot of things going on, but they feel quite isolated. Like the world's not really interacting and breathing in the same way that you get with Lord of the Rings. Like, but then again, with Lord of the Rings, you're going on a specific set journey, and this is more scattershot. So I don't hold it against it in the same way.
Yeah, I don't. Just to be clear, I don't hate the visuals of the show. There are like really amazing moments, but I do feel like, in general, it sometimes feels a bit bland, and no amount of... I don't know what it is, because clearly there's like a lot of work put into the costumes as well. I'm not just talking about how it's shot, I'm talking about the visuals of the sets and the props, and a lot of it is very good. I guess there were points where I was a little underwhelmed, especially because I think maybe the most interesting visuals come in the actual prologue. There's like a short sequence of you get basically like 5 or 10 seconds of this like red lit battle scene, which looks amazing, and you never see anything like that again. I'm kind of hoping to get more of that as we go forward. But
another thing visually, sort of touching back on the Mordor story, is that the town they're in the Southlands, like the village, they've got the really cool tower thing that they then knock down later on. But the actual village feels really tiny. It's like, why is she's like, oh yeah, I'm going to turn this whole town. It's like, there's like 5 people here, bro. Like, it's like if you were rolling up on London and trying to do that shit, maybe you'd have like a big army. But
it does feel like it doesn't quite get the same sense of scale, right?
No,
does it? And I get that maybe these days you can't just build Rohan.
In Numenor, it does. I think Numenor feels big. But then, actually, you know what? Saying that, I think that's the only time. Numenor and the Dwarven City underground.
The Dwarven City didn't feel that big. I feel like it didn't really make the most of that environment, personally.
You would have thought, for the amount of money they put into it, that you could have really made the scale feel huge. Yeah, because the more I think about it, as pretty as it does look, and I do think all of it looks pretty much consistently great. Yeah, there is a kind of... It feels like there's a few dozen extras just that didn't get the call to set.
I don't know, it's hard to put your finger on it.
It doesn't feel like filled out. Like, you've got so much space, you've got all these little grand areas and big sort of dramatic cities, apart from in Southlands, I don't know why. And no one, like, barely any fuckers living there apart from in Numenor.
I guess that's interesting that we both have a similar feeling there, that it's hard to explain why. It's something just feels a little bit off, I guess, is what I'm saying. So I guess the last thing to touch on in terms of the narrative of the show concludes, and I think this is probably one of them, like you said earlier, a big mystery, especially in the sort of final few episodes of the show, is who the fuck is Sauron?
Yeah.
Someone is going to be revealed to be Sauron. Who's it going to be? And it is revealed to be Halbrand, who is Galadriel's sort of semi-love interest.
Yeah.
And it's sort of revealed after this sequence where he goes, Elrond, Celebrimbor, why don't you make some magic rings? You just make them for the elves. And then it's amazing to me that this is how they decide to do this, because in my mind, having watched Lord of the Rings and played some of the games and whatnot, I always thought that the making of the rings was supposed to be this great deception. Like, he got played. And it really is, according to the show, just, you should make some rings.
Yeah,
and then they're like, it's really hard making these rings. We're using the wrong kind of air or metal or whatever.
We need to add an alloy to the mithril.
Like, it was just so... The last episode, I think, is the worst episode.
Yeah.
It's really embarrassing, especially that ending. And all the cutbacks to that, like, cringy prologue with Galadriel as a child and all of that.
Yeah.
I just thought it was really cringe. I don't know how else to say it.
I got some kind of enjoyment out of it because I correctly guessed who Sauron was. And I was like, So that's basically all I got out of it. But yeah, like you say,
it's not a very interesting reveal.
Yeah, and it's also kind of hard to work out what his goals have been up until this point. Like, I get the whole idea is that Sauron has to infiltrate and sort of, be this sort of whispering voice on the ear of the elves to get them to do what he wants without them realizing. But so we first meet him on a ship heading, supposedly to Valinor, but it's probably almost certainly from Valinor, and he's escaped somehow. That sort of element of his character is intriguing. You're like, obviously he's trying to get back, and he's going to use whoever's around him to help him achieve on his goal. But once he's back in like Numenor and that, he just sort of hangs around. He's like, I'm the king of the Southlands, by the way. He's like, oh shit, we should take you back to the Southlands. And then they go, he's the king of you guys. And everyone's like, yeah, go on, mate. And then he comes back and he does the deception.
He just feels like a complete non-presence in the show, though.
Yeah, well, it just kind of feels like
I didn't even think like, who's this Halbrand guy until like the last few episodes, because I was just so tuned out to.
He just kind of. Oh, that's the great deception route. He was so bland that he kind of staticked out, and that's like we just didn't even think of him as a threat. That's kind of genius.
I didn't even realise how great this show was.
If you think about it on those levels, it's just hard to find from an outside perspective a coherent through line for what his character's actually trying to achieve until the very end. And then by that point, it's such a sort of limp reveal. We don't really... It's a shock if you were kind of pinning your hopes on the stranger being Sauron.
I guess what it is that Halbrand is never really... It would be interesting as a twist reveal if it was like, Halbrand really wants this the whole time. He's like, I really, this is my motivation, whatever that is. And then at the end, it's twist. It's like, I did want this, but I was doing it this way. Or, I actually wanted this, so I was lying, but not really. Like, do you see what I mean? Like, but because he's just kind of chilling around Galadriel, and then like goes with her and is like, oh, I'm a bit sexy. Like, that's like kind of all it really feels like he did.
Yeah, and the reveal of him being like King of the Southlands is something he's really unwilling to talk about. So it's also not really a hugely compelling motivation for him to then go back. Like he has to be talked into it, which is a bit a strange choice.
Yeah. So generally speaking, where would you rank this? Because I know me and you, we both love Lord of the Rings. We both have generally not great feelings about the Hobbit films.
Yeah.
Where would you put this in the sort of pantheon of Lord of the Rings content?
If I was to sort of tear it out, well, obviously, this is...
Because for me, it is the worst thing.
So far, I think so. Because I think that the Hobbit films had their moments. Yeah. And I think I could sit down and watch
outside
those
of,
first
I'd say
two.
maybe Battle of the Five Armies is maybe worse.
Oh, as a singular
thing,
film, I would put that worse, 100%. But if you're talking about them as trilogies, as kind of serialized things, then this just has so little going for it in terms of intrigue and interest. Yeah. And at least The Hobbit had, some really good performances, some captivating, like some recreations of some really cool bits, like with Smaug and Gollum and things like that. So, for as mixed of a bag as those films ended up being, they had something. They had some intrigue.
So we seem to be sort of generally on the same page in terms of how we feel about the show itself. And it's kind of interesting to look at how the show has generally been received. It obviously does have a lot of fans. Yeah. And it has a fair amount of detractors also. It's interesting to compare it to The House of the Dragon and Andor, because I think those are obviously both franchise adaptations from existing things that have all come around the same time pretty much, and have done generally, I don't know how well they've done in terms of numbers, but in terms of how they've been received, I've seen absolute adoration for Andor in particular, 100%. And I've seen just sort of general good things to be said about House of the Dragon.
Which is a remarkable achievement given how much people had turned on Game of Thrones by the last series.
Yeah, actually like a much harder job than this, which is saying a lot, because to the credit of the show in a way, I guess, it is a very difficult job, I think, possibly to make something entertaining out of the Silmarillion, given that it's sort of been considered unadaptable for a long time.
So if you wanted to tell a story about the Silmarillion, you'd have to really have sort of specific episodes dedicated to each different thing. And in my mind, the logical thing to do is take one story that's really captivating.
Like an anthology of something.
Yeah, exactly, an anthology. But in my mind, the best way about adapting it would be just take one story that you think is brilliant, and maybe a few others that coincide in a similar era, and kind of build upon that. Which I think is what they've done here.
I guess the interesting thing about The House of the Dragon and Andor is basically taking an almost quite obscure character and just doing something with it. Yeah. Which is quite satisfying to see, because it's like, if you watch Rogue One, Cassian Andor, you may love Rogue One, but to me, he's a bit of a bland character. For most of the film, he does have some interesting elements, though. And it's basically taking those interesting elements and going, and then just doing loads with it, which is really interesting and fun to see. And then House of the Dragon is just like, we'll just go 100 years, whatever, before, and we'll just sort of tell a similar but sort of fun story, like, to pad out some background. But make it sort of its own thing with its own kind of vibe. It's not just Game of Thrones again. No. It's like, this is kind of its own thing. Yeah. And I think this show kind of had an opportunity to do that. Yeah. But I feel like it's sort of trying to tread a weird middle ground between being really similar to the, and relying a lot on references to the films, but being really not very much like them at all. No. Which is a bit confusing, I guess, from an audience perspective, because I've seen some people defend it. People who love this show, I've seen some people defend it and basically say it's actually very true to Tolkien's vision in its sort of slower storytelling and politicking and sort of whimsy and slow pacedness. And I guess my response would just be that even if that's true, it's not as good.
Right. Tolkien wasn't a screenwriter for a start.
Yeah, exactly right.
Making something true to a book or true to any story, it requires a level of sort of understanding of how to transform one format into another. Like Peter Jackson didn't just go bang, bang, here's the film exactly as the book. He took creative liberties, and some people who are big fans of the book, which you do get a lot of on Reddit, are not best pleased with some of those changes. But I think it's not about what you change, but how you change it and how well you execute those changes, how well you justify your changes. Because I think sometimes they're massively useful. So yeah, like having it being like, oh, this show was boring on purpose. Like, I don't know how true that statement is of it's true to the Silmarillion or it's true to his works, but it's kind of a moot point. Yeah. If the end product is still boring and still doesn't have that kind of gripping forward momentum, then who cares?
A good example I think is Game of Thrones Series 1 doesn't have any massive battles in it, really.
No.
Like, you could argue quite slow in terms of this sort of limited violence throughout it. You get like bits and pieces here, but it's mostly some intrigue, like a murder mystery, basically.
Yeah.
And it sort of builds up and culminates into something quite dramatic.
Yeah.
If you read the first Game of Thrones book, that's kind of what it's all about. It's just quite kind of like a slow intrigue with violent bits going on here and there, but it's not about massive battles, but it's still good.
And it's still, and that also gets criticised for being boring by Luddites.
But you have to be a Luddite to think that.
Yeah, and similarly, Breaking Bad Series 1, people say a lot of the same things, even though you can make kind of parallels across in terms of naturally building these characters into this one place, so you can keep escalating, because you don't want to start at the top point. And we're not asking this of the show either, of it being like, oh, it needs to be fucking
Breaking Bad.
It needs to be a Michael Bay film from the beginning, like just explosions and explosions. Like, the point is that in the nitty gritty of all of it, in like these intimate character moments, there is nothing. There's nothing to hold on to that drives it forward on a micro level. So that when it comes to the macro level, you have no interest anymore.
I found it an interesting criticism, because it might be true that it is truer to J.R.R. Tolkien to make a show in this style. I guess the reason I found it interesting is I don't know really what I value in that personally. I guess because a big talking point around this is it true to J.R.R. Tolkien and his vision of things, which is funny to hear, because obviously the Peter Jackson films were like lambasted by the Tolkien estate for not being true to his vision, making big changes, some of which I think are good. Like you said, like the scouring of the Shire is a massive part of the book that is cut out. And it works.
Yeah.
And it's good. And they remove stuff like Tom Bombadil, which a lot of people are mad about. And I think it's fine. I think
I don't understand it. Tom Bombadil is a baffling character.
I know. But like a lot of people are mad about it. And I think it's, that's the beauty of adaptation, is you can do a version of something.
Yeah.
And I just, I don't really see if this is more faithful, I don't even think that's necessarily good. And I don't think being faithful to something in your adaptation even offers anything in particular.
No.
If that makes sense.
Well, yeah, why do something so completely faithful when you already have that original? I understand it's a bit different when you're transforming written media into sort of a live action filmed media, but still, that you kind of want a different voice to come in. I would, certainly, and I do. And I think the thing because
otherwise just listen to the audiobook, right?
Right, well, there. When I have seen or experienced the media of something beforehand, so like a book or whatever it might be, and they adapt it into a film, and I'm disappointed with its changes to the media, it's not so much, I wish they'd followed it to the letter. It's if there's things they've missed from the book that would have made an improvement.
Yeah.
Or if they've missed out on like a level of tone, or missed opportunities in terms of adapting really interesting creative ideas, and they don't use those ideas, or they execute them poorly. But ultimately, it's all in the execution on that end. If it's a brilliant film and they miss out a bunch of shit, why does it matter?
Yeah, I think with adaptation, it can be really emotionally difficult for some people, because if you already have a pre-established emotional connection with a piece of media, and then you basically watch an adaptation, you can't help but have expectations.
Yeah.
And then if it does something that you feel betrays it, or they cut out something that you're familiar with, your reaction to that can be quite visceral. I remember as a kid, for example, watching Harry Potter 4 or whatever, and it cuts out like pretty much the entire prologue or whatever of that film with the Quidditch tournament and whatnot.
It cuts out loads of that,
it cuts out like tons, and I remember being really disappointed with that. But like watching it now, I can just see like they just didn't have time for it. You could not drag it. Or like I can understand why someone might watch the Girl with the Dragon Tattoo film and be really annoyed that it removes a bunch of the investigative journalism exposition dumping that they have in the first a few hundred pages of the book.
Right.
But I watch it and I'm like, this is just so streamlined, and it's still managed to be really faithful to the core story.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
It's a balancing act. Yeah. It always is. You can never have it one-to-one, because if you did, then the films would be as long as the books are. They'd be 100 hours long. Whatever. In
terms of being true to Tolkien, another really hot talking point has been the inclusion of actors of colour. A lot of black actors are in this. Asian actors, etc., etc. Whereas the Peter Jackson ones, it was like an avalanche of white people, obviously, right? And I guess that's another interesting point of contention, in that you have this sort of unbearable segment of YouTube where it's basically just really annoyed nerds going, "Oh, it should just be white people," and just basically like calling everything woke. And writing
if you aren't a straight white male, you are political.
Yes, pretty much.
That's what it is.
I guess it's worth pointing out that neither of our criticisms fall in line with any of that. No. I do think it's kind of funny in implication that you have a lot of actors of colour here. If this is to follow on canonically prior to Lord of the Rings, where the fuck did they go? Is there a very dark chapter of Hobbit history that we have not been told about?
Jesus.
What the fuck? I guess that's kind of funny, but
I just kind of edit it in my mind. Once you kind of get over that hill, if you are able to, if you are man enough to do such a thing, then it doesn't matter. There's
a truth to criticism in that it does feel very kind of Obama liberal Facebook mum, like girl power / whatever, in a sort of pandering way.
I do. I agree with you on that. It echoes of kind of like Disney. Yeah. Every time Disney have a new film out, they somehow have been. It's always the first film to feature a gay couple in it, even though the one they just released has a gay couple in it.
And it will always get edited out for the Russian and Chinese.
Yeah, exactly. It's not that including those things is bad. It's not at all. It's inherently positive.
It's expecting brownie points for it.
It's the corporatized version of wokeness, where it's like, oh, look how woke we are by our product. Like, we're losing value on our stocks. I'm glad they do it, because it's the sort of representation. It's that kind of sort of everyday representation. That if the really big guys are doing it and they have that representation.
I would do it just for spite for that segment of YouTube to get annoyed.
Oh yeah, for sure. Like I say, it's a kind of necessary thing. It's just frustrating when Amazon and Disney and whoever are just patting themselves on the back like, we're so fucking good.
Yeah, I guess it's interesting that every time anything comes out where there's now this like mini culture war that I try and avoid for the most part, but that obviously will exist with this. Are you excited for season 2?
I think I am. I do think I am. Because I hope that they've seen this backlash. They can't have ignored this backlash. Right, and will have taken on a lot of points in terms of improving. A lot of the gripes we have are gripes echoed across the community. So a good showrunner and writers will understand that and take some of that on board. They don't need to take all of it on board, because not all of it is necessarily constructive for them. But, if they do exactly how I said they should do it, then that would be brilliant. And I hope they're watching this video, which they definitely will never do. In a similar way, the last TV show we reviewed was Halo, and I'm excited for that as well in the same way, because it's like there's a possibility that someone within that group goes, oh yeah, we've been cocking this up.
In a way, Halo was much more interesting because it was a massive fucking train wreck, whereas this does have a base level of competence to it.
Yeah, which somehow makes it kind of less enjoyable to watch.
This is less interesting than Halo. Yeah. I guess that's kind of the thing. And Halo wasn't that boring compared to this. This is because the biggest criticism I think we have of this show is that it's really boring. boring.
If you want the TLDR version of this whole video, of however many hours this video ends up being, it's fucking boring. Is your, little sound bite. It
is really boring, and I don't really understand, I guess, from Amazon's perspective, why you would get two newbie showrunners to do maybe one of the most expensive TV shows of all time.
Baffling.
And I think it's interesting from some of the numbers I've read that this struggle to keep up with House of Dragon in terms of numbers. It didn't do that well, and it seemed to bleed viewers quicker than House of Dragons as well, despite having a really, really strong debut. I guess it's interesting because obviously with the numbers it got, if it wasn't Lord of the Rings, we wouldn't be talking about, is this a flop? Because if you just look at the numbers, they're very fucking high. So for any TV show, it has done a base level of well, but it doesn't seem like it's done that well.
Yeah, it's not done like 1 billion well or whatever, however much they've funneled into this.
And with TV shows, it's really hard to gauge as well.
Yes, true, especially in the streaming age. Can I just make one point?
Yes.
That some people say this shit all the time. It's like, oh, well, it's slow, but you've got to give it a few episodes to give it a chance, like 3 or 4 episodes. Oh, yeah, you watch, it's an 8-episode series. You've got to watch 6 before you really decide it. You see the show stats on, like, how many people tune in for a debut, for the premiere episode, and then they drop off. If you don't make that shit good immediately, everyone will fucking go. So don't act like you, like, it's not like a film. If you've bought a ticket to the film and you leave after 20 minutes, you're a fucking moron and you've wasted your money. But if you have paid a subscription package and you find an episode of something and you go, this is boring as shit, you won't watch it again.
Yeah, I mean, these are also the people who will be like, I can't watch a film, it's too much for my attention span. But then
I can't listen to an album. I don't have 40 spare minutes in the day, but I'll chain watch The Office 500 times. Sorry, that was just a little vent off my chest.
Your feelings are very valid, Adam. Yeah. But anyways, this has been our review of Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you like the video, press like. If you dislike the video, press dislike. Subscribe to the channel. We've got more videos coming in the new year. All kinds of stuff. And that has been us. Peace.
You said the same words. I fucking did that.